The phone rang at 9:47 on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks before my granddaughter's wedding, and I almost didn't pick it up. I'm glad to have you here. Stay with me until the end and tell me in the comments what city you're listening from, because what happened that night changed everything, and I still can't quite believe it was real. It was my daughter calling. I figured she wanted to talk about flowers or seating charts, or whether I'd finally bought a dress instead of wearing the same grey suit I'd worn to 3 funerals. Instead, when I answered, there was this strange muffled quality to the line, like she'd set the phone down without ending the call. And then I heard her voice, low and quick, talking to someone else in the room. Mum will sit at the back. Trust me. By the time she realizes nobody's coming to talk to her, the speeches will be over and we'll be cutting the cake. She won't make a scene. She never does. I sat very still in my kitchen on Aldridge Lane, with the dish towel still in my hand. My name is Ruth Calloway. I'm 67 years old, and I have spent most of my life being the woman who never makes a scene. A man laughed. My future grandson-in-law, I realized. And the toast? I already told the planner, my daughter said. When they call for the grandmother of the bride, just skip it. Skip the whole line. We'll say there was a printing error on the program. Honestly, who's going to question it? Half those people think she's the caterer's mother anyway. Then more laughter, the kind that's meant to be shared between people who understand each other perfectly. And then the line went dead, like she'd finally noticed the phone was still lit up in her hand. I stood there in my kitchen for a long time. The dish towel dripped a little puddle onto the linoleum, and I watched it spread. I want to tell you, I cried, but I didn't. Not right then. I think I was too surprised to cry. You'd think after 67 years a person would stop being surprised by the people she loves, but it turns out you never do. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the rest of it. I raised my daughter Diane on my own after her father walked out when she was 9. He didn't die. People always assume the husband died. Like that's the only acceptable reason a woman ends up alone with a child and a stack of bills. No, Frank just decided one autumn that the life we'd built wasn't the one he wanted, and he left for a woman he'd met at a sales conference in Tulsa, and that was that. He sent checks for a while. Then he sent excuses. Then he sent excuses. Then he sent nothing. I worked at a textile plant outside our town in the Carolinas for 19 years, and when the plant closed, I cleaned houses. And when my knees got bad, I took in mending and alterations, which I'd always done on the side anyway. I was good with a needle. My own mother taught me. I made Diane's prom dress and her graduation dress, and when she went off to college on a scholarship, I'd helped her chase down across 2 summers of paperwork. I sewed every curtain and cushion for her dorm room myself. She did well. I want to be clear about that because I'm proud of her even now. She became a hospital administrator in Charlotte. She married a decent enough man named Carl, an accountant, and they had 1 daughter, my granddaughter Paige, who I loved from the second the nurse handed her to me, wrapped up like a little loaf of bread. But somewhere along the way, Diane started to be embarrassed by me. It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow thing, like rust. The first time I noticed it, Paige was maybe 7, and Diane had a dinner party for some people from the hospital, and she asked me, very gently, if I would mind eating in the kitchen with Paige instead of at the table, because the conversation would be kind of work stuff, you know. Boring. I said sure. Of course, I'm good with kids. I told myself it made sense. Then there was the time she introduced me to her boss as the woman who helped raise Paige, not as her mother. The time she rewrote my answer when someone asked what I did, jumping in to say Mum's retired, she keeps busy, before I could say the word seamstress. She started correcting the way I talked. She bought me clothes for Christmas that were 2 sizes too small, to give you something to aim for, Mum, and I wore the sweaters anyway, stretched tight, because they were from her. 1,000 little cuts, none of them deep enough to die from. But you can bleed out slow, and nobody notices, least of all the person doing the cutting. The wedding was the worst of it. Paige was marrying into money. Her fiancé's family, the Hartleys, owned a chain of car dealerships across 3 states and a great big house out on a lake. And they had the kind of confidence that comes from never once in your life worrying about the electric bill. Diane was beside herself trying to keep up. She'd taken out a loan for her own outfit. She'd hired a planner who charged more than I made in a year. And every conversation we had about that wedding ended with her saying some version of "Just please, Mom, don't embarrass me." So when I heard her on that phone, planning to erase me from my own grandchild's wedding like a typo on a program, I wasn't surprised. I was just tired. Bone tired. I sat down at my kitchen table, and I poured myself a cup of decaf, and I thought about it. And the more I thought, the more I kept circling back to a box. Here's the thing I haven't told you yet. When Frank left all those years ago, I got a lawyer. Not because I had money for one, but because there was a legal aid clinic at the county courthouse and a young woman there named Sandra took pity on me. She helped me make sure Frank couldn't come back and claim anything. And in the process of going through everything, we found that my own father, who'd passed 2 years before, had left me something I'd never paid attention to. My daddy was a quiet man who worked at a lumber yard his whole life. But in 1971, he and 3 other men had pooled their money and bought a parcel of land downtown when downtown wasn't worth anything. Just scrubby lots near the old rail depot. The other 3 men eventually sold their shares back to my father over the years, one by one, because they needed cash, and my father, who never spent a dollar he didn't have to, bought them all out. By the time he died, he owned all of it free and clear, and he left it to me in a will so plain and short. It was almost funny. I didn't think much of it. It was just dirt by the railroad. I paid the property taxes every year, a few $100s out of stubbornness more than sense, because it was the last thing my daddy ever gave me, and I wasn't going to let the county take it for back taxes. For decades, I just paid the bill and forgot about it. But downtown changed. You've seen it happen in your own town, probably. The old depot got turned into a farmer's market. A brewery moved in, then a coffee roaster, then lofts, then a developer who wanted to build a whole mixed-use district. About 6 years ago, a real estate company started sending me letters asking if I'd sell. I threw them away. Then they started calling. I let it go to voicemail. And here is the part that still makes my hand shake a little when I tell it. 2 years ago, a man from that very same development company came to my door. Polite young fellow in a nice suit. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table, and he laid out a map and he showed me that the parcels my daddy had bought for almost nothing now sat right in the middle of the biggest commercial project the county had seen in 50 years. He told me what they were worth, and then he told me something I didn't know. The Hartleys, the very family my granddaughter was marrying into, the car dealership people with the house on the lake, had a signed agreement to build their new flagship dealership and corporate offices on land they were leasing. And a strip of that land, the access road, the part that connected the whole development to the highway, ran straight across one of my father's lots, which meant it was mine. The Hartleys had been leasing it, paying rent on it, for the last 4 years, to a holding company that managed my property for me, that I'd set up on Sandra's advice years before, never thinking it would matter. The checks came in. I didn't live large. I gave most of it to the women's shelter in town and the literacy program at the library, and I put the rest away, and I kept living in my little house on Aldridge Lane because it was paid off and it was mine and I liked my garden. Nobody in my family knew. Not Diane, not Paige, not anybody. Because the one time, years ago, I'd mentioned to Diane that Granddaddy had left me some land. She'd laughed and said, "What, those weeds by the train tracks? Mom, you should just give it away, it's costing you in taxes." So I never brought it up again. It became my quiet thing, my one private dignity. And now, sitting at my table the night I heard my daughter plan to make me invisible, I remembered something else. The young man in the suit had told me the Hartley's lease on that access strip was up for renewal. It came due, he'd said, checking his folder in the late spring. The renewal was supposed to be automatic, a formality. The development couldn't function without it. The whole project, the dealership, the offices, the grand opening they'd scheduled, All of it depended on a road that ran across my father's lumberyard money. The lease came due 11 days after my granddaughter's wedding. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up until the sky went grey, and I thought about my daddy and the box of papers from Sandra that I still kept in the bottom of my closet, and a letter my father had written me that I'd read maybe twice in 30 years. I got it out around 5 in the morning. It was just one page in his careful pencil. He'd written it knowing he was sick, I think, though he never said. Most of it was practical, about the property taxes and where the deed was kept. But at the bottom he'd written, "You always made yourself small so other folks could feel big, Ruthie. Don't. You come from people who held on to what was theirs. Hold on to yourself." I read that line about 40 times. The next morning I called Sandra. She's retired now, but she still does a little work, and she remembered me right away. I told her everything. There was a long pause on the line, and then she said, very carefully, "Ruth, do you understand what you're holding?" "I think I'm starting to," I said. What I did over the next 2 weeks, I did calmly. That's the part nobody believes. There was no screaming, no confrontation. I just made some phone calls and signed some papers in Sandra's office, with her new young partner explaining each one in plain language, so I understood every word. I learned more about commercial leasing in 14 days than I'd learned in my whole life before. In the meantime, I played my part. I let Diane believe everything was fine. When she called to tell me what to wear and where to stand, I said, "Of course, dear." When she forgot to add me to the rehearsal dinner list and then made it sound like my fault, I said, "Don't worry about it. I'll just see everyone at the wedding." She was so relieved I wasn't making trouble that she actually thanked me. She said, "I knew you'd understand, Mom." I said, "I understand completely," and I did. Paige called me once during those weeks, the only time, my granddaughter. I'd hoped, I think, that she didn't know, that this was all her mother's doing. But she got on the phone and she was sweet and rushed, and she said, "Grandma, I know the wedding stuff is a lot, and Mum says you're being really cool about everything, and it means so much that you get it." And I asked her gently, "Get what, sweetheart?" And there was a little pause, and she said, "You know, that it's a certain kind of crowd, that you'd be more comfortable just like being there and not having to worry about all the formal stuff." That's when I knew she was in on it. And I'll be honest with you, that hurt worse than Diane. Because I'd held that child the day she was born. I'd sewn her Halloween costumes. I'd sat in the hospital the time she had her tonsils out, because Diane had a meeting, and she'd let herself be talked into being ashamed of me, the way you let yourself be talked into anything when the people around you make it sound like the reasonable thing. I didn't argue with her. I said, "I just want you to be happy, honey." Which was true. It's always been true. That's the trap of being a mother. You keep wanting them to be happy even while they're breaking your heart. The wedding was at the Hartley's lake house, which they'd had tented and lit up like something out of a magazine. 200 guests, a band, an ice sculpture, which I thought was a strange thing to spend money on in June, but nobody asked me. I came alone in my grey suit, the one I'd worn to 3 funerals, because it turned out to be exactly the right thing to wear. I parked my old Buick between 2 cars worth more than my house. A young man at a podium checked my name against a list, frowned, checked again, and finally waved me through with the kind of smile people give you when they've decided you don't matter. They sat me at table 19, back corner, near the service entrance, where the waiters came and went through swinging doors and the air smelled like the kitchen. The people at my table were distant, Hartley cousins who'd clearly also been filed under "doesn't matter." We nodded at each other. One woman asked if I was with the catering company. I said no, I was the bride's grandmother. She looked at me like I'd told a small lie and went back to her wine. I watched the ceremony from the back. Paige looked beautiful. I want to say that plainly because it's true. She looked like her mother did at that age, and like I did at that age. All 3 of us caught for a second in the same young face under different years, when the officiant talked about family, about the people who'd shaped this young woman into who she was. I sat very still and waited to hear my name, the way you wait for a bus you already know isn't coming. It didn't come. There was a printing error on the program after all. I'll tell you the exact moment, because I've gone over it many times since. It was during the reception, after the toasts I wasn't part of, after the cake I helped pay for in a way none of them knew. The band was tuning up. James Hartley, the father, the dealership king, was holding court near the bar with a glass of bourbon, telling some story that had the men around him laughing on cue. And a young woman in a delivery uniform came in through the front, holding a flat envelope, and asked one of the planners where she could find Mr. James Hartley. There was a little commotion. The planner pointed. The young woman walked across that beautiful tented floor in her ordinary shoes and handed James Hartley the envelope and asked him to sign, and he signed without thinking, still chuckling at his own story. The way a man does when he's never once in his life received bad news he couldn't buy his way out of. He opened it. I watched his face from table 19 near the kitchen doors with the whole length of that gorgeous party between us. I watched his smile go. Diane saw it happen. She was always good at reading a room when there was advantage in it. She came toward her new in-law before she even understood why, that hostess instinct kicking in, and she got there just as James Hartley said, too loud to his wife. "What in God's name is this?" And his wife took the pages and read, and the colour left her face. Notice of non-renewal, effective the date the lease expired, 11 days out. The access road, the one thing the whole development couldn't live without, signed by the holding company. And underneath that, because I'd asked Sandra to make sure it was on there in plain ink, the name of the owner. My name. Ruth Calloway. Diane read it over her son-in-law's shoulder, and I will never, as long as I live, forget her face when she looked up and found me, across that whole room, sitting where she'd put me by the kitchen doors in my funeral suit. The band had stopped. People were starting to turn. Paige, still in her wedding dress, was being pulled toward her father-in-law by some current of confusion, asking what was wrong, and James Hartley said the only true thing he said all night. He said, "Your wife's grandmother owns my road." And Diane crossed that floor toward me. She crossed all 200 guests, past the ice sculpture, melting into its silver tray, and she stood in front of me with her wedding makeup and her loan finance dress, and she whispered, so the cousins couldn't hear, "Mom, what did you do?" I stood up. I'm not a tall woman. I had to look up at her, my own daughter, and I said in a voice I kept very steady, "I sent the family a wedding gift, Diane. I do hope they like it. I'd love to tell you the whole room went silent and somebody clapped. It wasn't like that. It was messier and quieter and stranger than any movie. There was just this spreading hush, like a stain, and people leaning to ask each other what was happening, and James Hartley raising his voice at a planner who had nothing to do with anything, and my granddaughter standing in the middle of it all, in her white dress, looking at her mother, and then at me, and then at her mother again, trying to understand a story she'd only ever heard one side of. I picked up my little clutch purse. I'd made it myself years ago, out of fabric left over from a job, and I walked toward the front of the tent, past the table where I should have sat, past the empty space in the program where my name should have been read, past my daughter, who reached out and touched my arm and said, "Mom, wait, you don't understand. The lease, the whole project. Do you have any idea what this means?" "Yes," I said. "I have a very good idea what it means. I've had 2 weeks to think about it, which is 2 weeks longer than you ever gave me." And I kept walking. She called me that night. Of course she did. It was almost midnight, and I was sitting on my own porch with a cup of decaf, listening to the crickets, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, which I can only describe as the absence of a weight I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it was there. The phone lit up. Her name. I let it ring twice and then I answered. "Where are you?" she said. Her voice was raw, like she'd been crying or shouting or both. James Hartley is threatening to sue. Paige's wedding is ruined. The reception ended early. Everyone left. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family? I'm home, I said, on my porch. It's a nice night. That's it? That's all you've got to say? She was crying now, the angry kind. How could you do this to me? To Paige, on her wedding day? And I want you to understand, I didn't say it cruelly. I was past cruel. I just said very quietly, did you like the gift, Diane? There was a silence then that I don't have words for. And in that silence then I don't have words for. And in that silence, I think, for the first time in years, my daughter actually heard me. I heard you, I said. On the phone 3 weeks ago. You called me, and you set the phone down, and I heard you and your son-in-law plan to skip my name in the program, to seat me by the kitchen so I'd give up and leave, to tell people I was the caterer's mother. I heard all of it, Diane. And I didn't make a scene, the way you said I wouldn't. You were right about that. I've never made a scene in my life. But I'm 67 years old, and I have decided I am done making myself small so that other people can feel big. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then, in a small voice that sounded like the little girl I used to sew dresses for, she said, I didn't know about the land. I know you didn't, I said. You told me to give it away. You called it weeds by the train tracks. What happened after that took a long time, and I won't pretend it was tidy. The Hartleys did not sue in the end because their lawyers told them what mine had already told me, which was that I had every right not to renew, and that the development project either negotiated with me or rerouted around me at enormous cost. They negotiated. I'll spare you the details, but I did fine, better than fine. I made sure the new lease included a clause that the access road be named after my father, who'd bought scrubland with lumberyard wages and held on to it. And so there is now, downtown, a road with my daddy's name on a green sign, and every time I drive under it, I say hello to him. I took some of the money, and I did the thing I'd been quietly doing all along, only bigger. There's a vocational program now at the community college, sewing and tailoring and small business basics, mostly for women starting over after a divorce or a layoff or a husband who left for a sales conference in Tulsa. I teach a class there 2 mornings a week. The women are scared and proud and trying, and I love them because they remind me of myself at every age I've ever been. Diane and I did not speak for 4 months. Paige reached out first, actually. She came to my house alone, sat at my kitchen table. The same table, and she cried and apologized, and she said, I let them make me ashamed of you, and you're the best person I know, and I will never understand why I did that. And I held her hand and told her the truth, which is that shame is the easiest thing in the world to catch from the people around you and the hardest thing to give back. Her marriage didn't last, as it happens. Not because of me. The Hartley boy turned out to be exactly the kind of man his father was, and Paige figured that out faster than I figured out about Frank, which I count as progress across the generations. She moved back closer to home. She comes to my sewing class sometimes, just to sit in the back and watch. She's learning. She's terrible at it. Lopsided seams. But she's learning. Diane took the longest. Pride does that. But she called me one day in the fall, almost a year after the wedding, and she didn't ask for anything, which was new. She just said she'd been thinking about her father, about how she used to be afraid of being left, and how somewhere along the way she'd decided the way not to be left behind was to make sure she was always standing with the people who mattered, and that she'd gotten so worried about being left that she'd left me first, a little at a time, for years. I told her I forgave her, which I did, but I also told her something Sandra once said to me, that forgiveness and trust are 2 different accounts, and you can pay back one without the other being full. We have coffee now, the 2 of us, once a month. She's careful with me, in a way she never used to be. Not afraid. Careful, like she finally understands I'm a person who can be lost. The other night Diane asked me, over our coffee, whether I ever felt bad about the wedding, whether it had been too much. The road, the lease, the whole public undoing of it. I thought about it honestly before I answered. Because she deserved that, and I said no. I said the wedding wasn't the gift. The gift was finally letting myself be seen after a lifetime of standing in the back hoping nobody would notice me and being heartbroken every time nobody did. My daddy was right. I come from people who held on to what was theirs. It just took me 67 years to understand that the most valuable thing he left me wasn't a strip of dirt by the railroad. It was the instruction at the bottom of that letter, the one I'd read twice in 30 years and now read every morning, taped to my refrigerator next to a lopsided pot holder. My granddaughter made me. Hold on to yourself. I am. Finally. And I promise you, it is never, ever too late to start. I used to think being a good mother meant disappearing whenever I was inconvenient, sitting in the kitchen, skipping my own name in the program, wearing the sweater 2 sizes too small because it came from Diane. For most of my 67 years, I called that love, but I've come to understand it was something closer to fear. The fear that if I ever took up space, the people I loved would finally have a reason to leave. So I left myself first, a little at a time, the way Diane later admitted she'd left me. Here is what I learned the hard way. Sitting at that kitchen table the night I heard them planning to skip my name. Everything that happens to us grows out of something we did or didn't do, like a garden grows from whatever seeds got dropped in the dirt. I had spent decades teaching my daughter, without ever saying a word, that I would always shrink to make room for her comfort. So she grew up expecting me to shrink. Paige watched her mother and learned the same lesson. None of them were born cruel. They were taught, patiently, by a woman who thought silence was the same thing as kindness. The wedding didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of 1,000 small surrenders I'd made and called peace. So when I finally held my ground, it wasn't really about the land or the lease or the road downtown. The deepest thing my father gave me wasn't that strip of dirt. It was the quiet knowing of right from wrong. The part of me that understood it is not loving to let someone treat you as nothing because you are teaching them they may treat the next vulnerable person that way too. That clear sense of what's right is what let me act without cruelty. I never raised my voice. I never lied. I simply stopped pretending I didn't matter. But knowing what's right isn't enough on its own. I had to be smart about it. I called Sandra. I read every page. I learned more about commercial leases at 67 than most people learn in a lifetime because I refused to be a woman. Things simply happened to. And then I needed the plain, stubborn grit to wait 2 weeks to say, of course, dear, to sit at table 19 by the kitchen doors and let it all unfold, when every soft old instinct in me wanted to keep the peace and disappear one more time. If there's anything I'd hand to you across this table, it's this. Be the kind of person who knows what's decent and refuses to abandon it, even for the people you love most. Be willing to learn, to ask questions, to understand the thing in front of you instead of looking away from it, and find the steadiness to do the hard, quiet thing when the easy thing is to shrink. My daddy wrote me one line I now read every morning, taped beside a lopsided potholder my granddaughter made. Hold on to yourself. It is never, ever too late to begin.